Hello and welcome to Hamilton, the podcast. I'm Vinton Bayne.
And I'm Robbie Hurlocker. We're happy to have you with us today as we share some of our excitement for Hamilton, an American musical written by Lin-Manuel Miranda. So, Vinton, how do you feel about a hip-hop musical based on the life and times of the first Treasury Secretary of America?
If you had asked me that just a few months ago, my answer would have been, what? And most likely, why?
And that's exactly the response I get whenever I share this around the dinner table with family or across the coffee table with friends. I've been in no fewer than 5 coffee shops around Oklahoma City singing the entire first song for a friend just in the middle of this coffee shop.
And these aren't planned performances.
Oh, no, not at all. I'm just sitting there surrounded by strangers looking to one of my friends in front of me saying, you need to love this thing that I love. And so I'm like, listen to me. How does a bastard orphan, son of a whore and a Scotsman, dropped in the middle of a forgotten spot in the Caribbean by providence and poverty and squalor, grow up to be a hero and a scholar? The $10 founding father without a father got a lot farther by working, a lot harder by being a lot smarter by being a self-starter. By 14, they placed him in charge of a trading charter, and I keep going through the whole song, and then I try to start the next one too, but I usually lost him by then.
So with how enthusiastic you are about it, that raises the question, how did you get into Hamilton, the musical?
Well, I got into Hamilton. My good friends, James and Rebecca, my college roommate and his wife, sat me down a little over a year ago and said, you need to watch this video from about 2009, give or take, where Lin-Manuel Miranda is standing in front of the Obamas at the White House at this poetry night. And he says, I have this idea for a concept album and a hip-hop album based on the life of Alexander Hamilton. And everyone chuckles. It's like a weird thing. And he says, I want to start rapping this thing for you. And he tells this story through a hip-hop song. And it ends up becoming the first song, the prototype for the first song in the musical. And it just boggled my mind because I knew nothing about the story of Alexander Hamilton before listening to that musical.
Yeah, just to emphasize how absurd it was to pick Alexander Hamilton to do this with. When he mentions it at the White House, like you said, people start laughing when he says it. And then he does the part of the musical and they're all getting into it, the beat, they start clapping along. Mm-hmm. But then it comes to the part where the music stops and he goes, I am Alexander Hamilton. Yeah. And they all break out laughing. Like, this is so absurd and so
it's
ridiculous.
Such a nerdy
Why
thing.
are you picking this person to write about in a musical?
Yeah, but once you understand his story, you understand that it makes perfect sense. We both have sat down with bad history teachers before and bad history textbooks where you're just told this date, memorize this name, look at this war that happened at this time period. Memorization is not a good way to learn history.
No.
But when you learn history in a story, you really start connecting with the people and the people that are being shared. Like our friends at the Story Wonk podcast will tell you that all good stories are driven by conflict. And no founding father knew conflict more than Alexander Hamilton. This guy wouldn't shut up. He found beef with Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Adams, George Washington every now and then. He had the reputation for being George Washington's puppet master, but they didn't agree all the time. This guy was surrounded by conflict throughout his entire life.
Right. And so it's a true underdog story. He came from adversity and problems before he even reached America. And then he gets to America and has to try to work his way up this political ladder to become somebody, to do something with his life, and finds adversity. He finds enemies. He makes enemies even out of his own best friends. And the whole time he just keeps heaping problems on you. The whole time you feel like he's this underdog that you're rooting for throughout the whole musical. Left and right, things keep happening to him. And all the way leads up to, spoilers, him being in a duel where he gets shot. And even then you feel like he's this underdog trying to overcome something. And finally you think he might have overcome it when he gets shot and he knows what was going to happen. He wrote it in his journals. But then after he gets shot and he's killed, he's defamed by his enemies and they start making up things about him and trying to put these labels on him and these things that weren't necessarily true. And his wife the whole time is having to fight for his identity, saying if they only knew Hamilton the way I knew him, if they only knew my Hamilton, the truth about the situation, she's having to fight for that and have to have a biography written about him from his letters and from his family, trying to put all this together so that we can know who he is. And it goes all the way up to modern day where we've slowly forgotten him, even from the fight that his wife put in so that we would know him. We slowly forgot him again. We might teach about him in high school classes. We might know a little bit here and there. And obviously there's scholars who write about him and scholars who read about him. But for the main everyday American, we don't know too much about him.
Yeah, America forgot him.
America did forget him. And so then you come all the way up to now and you get a book written by Chernow who writes this beautiful biography about Hamilton. And that does entice a few people, the type of people who would read a political biography, which is probably in the minority. I don't know the exact percentages, but it's not going to be a lot of people. And then you have Lin-Manuel come up and read this biography by chance on a plane, decide this has to be a musical. Someone already wrote this. And no, it wasn't. So he decides he's going to do it, but from today's voice, a hip hop voice, bringing in a whole new culture that completely mirrors the adversity and the passion from that story in a hip hop musical. And then it brings it forth to a new generation. You start seeing these things on YouTube, on NPR, on late shows, and it brings it to a whole diverse group of people that even you may be more political than I am, but I'm not very political. I would not have heard of this had it not been for Lin-Manuel's musical.
Absolutely. I wouldn't have even picked up on this. You mentioned his wife was defending his legacy after he died. I think it's really interesting to lean into that because in a big way, Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical is a climax of what his wife started, trying to defend his legacy. Throughout his whole life, like you said, he has these political enemies that are attacking him left and right. And once he dies, when most people die, the polite thing to do is to say something nice about the person.
Right.
Even if they were jerks, at the funeral, you're going to say, this person was kind, he did something. You're going to find something to lie about. You can say he had good style sense or something, if you have to stretch for it. But when Alexander Hamilton died, this is a guy who his political enemies could hardly hold a match to him while he was living. But once he died, it was open season on Hamilton's reputation.
Right, so this musical is a continuation of the defense of his legacy. And on that note, let's go ahead and jump into this first track, which is an introduction and a summary to his life.
Yeah, it's kind of a prologue. All of this first song happens before Alexander Hamilton really steps foot on American soil.
Right.
So each of the cast members come forward. Most of them are dressed in white at the beginning because they're not actually in their outfits that they're wearing for the rest of the musical, but they come forward to the front of the stage. And Aaron Burr is the one that begins this musical and starts it off.
Right, and you'll see that throughout the whole musical. It almost appears that Aaron Burr is our main character.
Yeah, he's a narrator for sure. Like at each of the key moments in this story, you hear this theme: the how does a bastard, orphan, son of a whore, or later on, like how does a ragtag volunteer army in need of a shower somehow defeat a global superpower?
Right. So you have those questions that bring up the absurdity of this whole musical, even like how does someone who came from such humble origins and more than humble, disastrous origins,
absolutely,
come to America, become a founding father, become the guy on this $10 bill, and become such a powerhouse that created a lot of what our nation is today?
Yeah. So right at the beginning, you see this highlighted, and it's really a blight on Alexander Hamilton's parentage from the very beginning. A lot of his enemies are really obsessed with the fact that he is a Creole bastard, in the words of John Adams later on. And they don't let him forget that he was abandoned as a child and that he was orphaned by his parents, and he doesn't have this broad parentage that a lot of the founding fathers got to grow up with. They got to grow up in privileged plantations, and Alexander Hamilton grows up on the streets of St. Croix.
Right. And it mentions that his mother was a whore. And that's not necessarily a truth about the way she lived her life, but more so a legal declaration forced on her by her first husband.
Yeah, her first husband accused her of adultery, and we don't really know. She wasn't allowed to defend herself, so it could be that it was a valid accusation, could be that it wasn't. Regardless, she spent 3 to 6 months imprisoned for this charge of adultery because her first husband had a case against her, took her to court. She couldn't defend herself. She was locked up for 6 months. And to show his little bit of his own naivete, he expected her to come back happy and reformed and come back to the marriage excited to be a perfectly submissive wife.
And he was wrong.
Absolutely. So eventually Rachel Hamilton leaves that island, runs away to another island in the Caribbean islands, and she meets this guy named James Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton's the son of a Scotsman. James Hamilton, his father, was the fourth son of a Scottish family, and he was pretty poor in general. His family was rich. His oldest brother was rich. His older brothers were rich, but he was kind of poor. So James Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton's father, was notoriously in debt. He often was... He was a part of these bad business ventures. He was unable to sustain his family, to support his family. When Rachel joins up with him, they actually have 2 sons together. James Hamilton has James Jr. and Alexander. And you don't ever get to see James Hamilton Jr. in this particular musical because he never actually played a part in Alexander Hamilton's life. They were kids together and they grew up as teenagers, But if you fast forward until close to his dying days, Alexander Hamilton never reconnected with his brother until he was already well advanced as advanced as he would get in age.
So there actually is some questions about his father, because then he went to live with someone else who bared a resemblance of him.
Yeah, that's true. So after his father split and left Hamilton alone, and his mother died, this other person came in and volunteered to adopt Alexander Hamilton, but refused to take James Hamilton in. And there are a lot of historians that question whether that's because Alexander was actually his legitimate child and not the child of James Hamilton who abandoned him.
Right. And unfortunately, we don't have any pictorial reference to know this ourselves. We just have the writings of people saying that they looked an awful lot alike.
Right. There are plenty of journal entries and letters that are shared back and forth. People that, like one of Hamilton's employers early on, marked about this particular resemblance. It was like spitting image of this guy that took him in. It was interesting. So all throughout his life, he has to deal with these really personal attacks about being the son of a whore, being the son of this Scotsman, or possibly an illegitimate bastard from another marriage in general. So this haunts him throughout the rest of his life. You almost wonder whether he was spurred on by this. Like, a lot of my own memories, I'm like, if someone tells me I can't do it, I'm going to work harder to overcome.
Right, which is what you definitely see in Hamilton. The whole point that it brings up in this song is that he had to work harder. He had to hear that voice saying, you got to fend for yourself.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what else can we get through as we go through these lyrics?
As if the problem of parentage wasn't enough, you start to see all these other problems piling in around him during his early childhood in the world that he lived in. The hurricanes, the sickness, the child labor, and the slave trade being strong there, and slaves being mistreated, slaughtered, and carted.
Yeah, and here early on, you do see that seed planted in Alexander Hamilton's life, the seed that grows into the full-fledged abolitionist that he becomes as he grows older, and he consistently is opposed to slavery.
Right. So he gets a job clerking for his late mother's landlord, trading sugar cane and rum and all the things he can't afford. So it kind of brings up that point where he's a penniless worker.
Yeah, and he's a child laborer too.
Yeah, he's not old enough, especially not in our current United States, to be working.
Absolutely. That's actually something later historians have looked back on and criticized him for, is that he set up a system of capitalism that he honestly thought children should be allowed to work at an early age, not because he was in favor of forcing children into slavery
Sure.
or child labor, but because he believed in making America into a meritocracy where someone like him, who had a deadbeat dad and a dead mother, could come into their own and take a job at an early age, learn a trade, become an apprentice in this trading industry, and actually make something out of his life.
Right. So he does this as a child, starts working and starts doing things. At this point, he's bringing in all these books. He's learning. He's reading all these things, and his mind's growing. He's starting to write for the first time. And
yeah.
He writes a poem, right?
Yeah, he writes a poem and gets it published in the newspaper. He writes a poem about this hurricane that came into this region and kind of devastated their island.
And so this goes around and people start reading it and they start realizing there's something special about this kid. And
yeah.
I know the world I live in, there's a lot of people doing a lot of special things, but you have to be doing something really special to get a whole community to come around you and start raising money as they do here to send you to a mainland to further your education and make it possible for you to go do something with your life.
Yeah, and here you get to see one of the first major themes that comes into Hamilton the musical, where you see that if you try hard enough, you can overcome the odds. You can overcome your situation, that there is such a thing as privilege and disadvantage in life. Hamilton started off at a big disadvantage coming from behind, but he believes throughout his whole life that he can write his way out. He can write his way out of trouble. He can write his way into success, and he can start doing something with his life. He never gets discouraged. He definitely gets knocked down a few times, and we'll see that as we go throughout this musical. But early on, he has this ambition and this drive that no one would look at him and say, you know what, if you just laid down right now and just gave up and decided to stay in this trading industry and just work this one job for the rest of your life on this British colony, you would be fine. But that said, that's not who Hamilton was.
Right. And so his community decides, it would be best for him if they could raise the funds and send him to New York. In New York, you can be a new man.
Yeah, the chorus is swelling and everything's getting louder and louder and everything's building up to this point where they are emphasizing that no matter what has happened to you before, you can start over in America.
Right. And we did skip, and I do want to go back to when Hamilton first takes the stage. You have Lin-Manuel take the stage, and he sings that refrain that's going to come up over and over again throughout the musical.
Alexander Hamilton. My name is Alexander Hamilton.
And there's a million things I haven't done, but just you wait. And so that's really a great introduction to Hamilton from himself, from his own point of view. There's a million things he hasn't done. Just you wait. That'll come up again later. You'll see it when his parentage is questioned by a girl he thinks is cute. He says, well, there's a million things I haven't done. Just wait. And it's like, he knows he's capable of something. He knows he has something to give if people would just give him a chance.
Yeah, this is the American dream at the beginning of Hamilton's story.
Right. So he goes to New York. At this point in the musical, we stop the narrative flow to get introduced to a few of the other characters. And one of the interesting things here is that you have multiple characters played by the same actor.
Yeah, Lin-Manuel Miranda, being the brilliant writer that he is, inserts a lot of double entendre into this song and throughout the whole musical, to where you see that the actor who plays Hercules Mulligan, a great character in the first act, he turns around in the second act and he plays James Madison. In the first act, the actor who plays Marquis de Lafayette, another brilliant actor, turns around and he is now Thomas Jefferson. So when you hear the phrase, "we fought with him," you want to hear it two separate ways. You hear, "we fought with him."
During the war, fought by his side.
And then "we fought with him."
In cabinet battles and in political debates.
Yeah, these are his comrades at arms and his political enemies. So that phrase, "we fought with him," is meaningful. The next phrase, "me, I died for him," was uttered by the actor who plays John Laurens, the abolitionist best friend of Alexander Hamilton in the first act, who actually dies in one of the few songs that is not in the soundtrack. So it's worth pausing for just a second on this to say that almost every single word of Hamilton the musical is on the soundtrack. Because it is a hip-hop album and a hip-hop musical, you're able to sit down and listen to it straight through and hear almost the entire story. But Lin-Manuel Miranda decided that he would leave one song out for the sake of theatergoers. So when they come, they could hear one thing new. And they took out the death scene for John Laurens from the soundtrack. So this phrase, "me, I died for him," you get to hear it through the voice of the actor who plays John Laurens.
Who is the same actor who plays Philip Hamilton, his oldest son, who then dies protecting his father's honor in a duel.
Yeah, and in Philip's duel, it's almost a chilling foreshadowing of what's to come at the end of this story between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton, because you see so many parallels between Philip's death and his father, Alexander Hamilton's death.
So the next line we have here is by George Washington himself. "Me, I trusted him." And that's a big deal, because here you have somebody that we do know about outside of a musical or even reading a biography. We are all raised learning who George Washington is as United States citizens.
Yeah, he's kind of the big deal. He's the venerated Virginian veteran that we've been waiting for this whole time, which brings up a point. I love the alliteration that's scattered throughout this musical. Lyrically, Lin-Manuel Miranda is just brilliant. You'll see this, we'll repeat that over and over again, I'm sure, but the alliteration that's scattered throughout this, like, our cabinet's fractured into factions, breaking down like fractions, or my favorite, meddling in the middle of a military mess. It's just beautiful lyrically, the way he gets into these things.
Yeah, with the alliterations and the double entendres, you see that this musical is actually crafted like a masterful puzzle. When I first listened to it, I did not catch half these things. And now every time I re-listen to it, I catch more and more. And talking to you and talking to other people, it's like we all put pieces of that puzzle together, and you just think, how do you create something like this that has so many pieces that people can't even catch the first time around?
Yeah, the community building aspect of what Hamilton the musical has become is just so cool. I can talk about this with my friends James and Rebecca. I can talk about this with you. I can talk about it on social media and find friends across the country that are in love with this. I actually visited New York City recently and stood in line for the lottery tickets to visit this because it's sold out for many, many more months. So I wanted to stand in line and get lottery tickets to join this. I didn't win, but I did find one of my Twitter followers in the line with me at Hamilton the musical. It was just fantastic to see someone that I'd never met in real life sharing my own excitement in exactly the same place as I am. And I'm an Oklahoma boy who just happened to be in New York City that one day in the same moment.
Right, and so talking about how much we loved him, the next line is me,
I loved him.
And that's coming from Eliza and Angelica, and the same actress here plays another two characters, Peggy and Mariah.
Yeah, Peggy Schuyler, who's the little sister to the Schuyler sisters, and Mariah Reynolds, who eventually seduces and has an affair with Alexander Hamilton. It's the first sex scandal in American history.
Right, so then you move on to Burr himself, who has been speaking a lot in this song, introducing himself, and me, I'm the damn fool that shot him, bringing up the very ending of the musical about how Alexander Hamilton himself dies here at the very beginning.
And on that line, I got my littlest sister, who was 10 at the time, to fall in love with Hamilton, the musical. I had to make sure she wouldn't shout this line in the middle of the grocery store and when everyone's surrounding her to say, I'm the damn fool that shot him. But it is such a brilliant line in this part of the musical because everything's been building up to this moment. He's the guy that started this musical. You're not really sure who he is yet. Then he steps forward and you realize this is the guy who's going to end Hamilton's story, so to speak.
Yeah, and so then we have that refrain brought up again, except this time it's not spoken by Hamilton, it's spoken by the whole company of the musical, and they say, there's a million things I haven't done, but just you wait. And to me, that's an interesting point, saying that the world here is believing in him, saying, oh man, it's going to be great to see the things you're going to do. So then Burr comes back in and says, what's your name, man? Which is the response to people who are excited about Hamilton, like, who's this person? And then the company proudly proclaims Alexander Hamilton, and that's the end of this first track. Is the company itself, not just Hamilton himself, the whole company of the musical proudly proclaiming his name in excitement, like about the things that are about to happen throughout this musical and throughout Hamilton's life.
And so you could classify this as the prologue to his story. But I think there are a lot of elements inside of this particular song that are introduced that are so important to the themes that you'll see throughout everything. You'll see the conflict between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton obviously play out until the end of his life. That's the main conflict that overlaps with this whole story. Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton live very, very different lives, and you'll see them in the very next scene sitting in a tavern together, getting to know one another, and you see from the very beginning that Aaron Burr has a very different philosophy in life than Alexander Hamilton does. Hamilton's philosophy is, no matter what happens to me, I am going to push forward, I'm going to make something, and I am going to write my way out of hell. Aaron Burr has a very different philosophy, and I think we'll dive into some of what that is next week.
Yep, next week, 1776, New York City, we're going to have Hamilton meeting Burr. As of right now, we're not actually sure how many songs we're going to be covering with each episode. Most likely more than one. There might be a few songs where we have to take an all episode like this introduction one, but we can't necessarily do one per episode. It's going to take a whole year. We want it to go a little faster than that, cover a little more ground. So we'll see how this thing plays out.
Yeah, the point of this podcast has been to share a lot of our own excitement with you. We hope that some of you will go back and read the Ron Chernow biography or listen to the whole musical for the first time, or you'll just maybe hear about this guy from a fresh perspective.
Or you'll travel to New York and get to see the musical. Or maybe by the point in time that you're listening to this, it will be traveling itself and you'll get to see it in your own hometown. Or perhaps, as we're all hoping, it'll get recorded and then we can watch it in our own homes with our friends and have watching parties.
Yeah, but if you are able to listen to this podcast and feel a little more interest in this first Treasury Secretary of the United States of America, we think that we'll have done our job.
So thanks again for listening. If you'd like to jump in the conversation with us, we're both on Twitter. I'm at FleshEater.
And I'm at Alpha Knight.
We would also like to thank friend of the show, David Newcomb, for recording our wonderful intro and outro music.
Until next time, I'm Vinton Bayne.
And I'm Robbie Hurlocker.
And this has been
Hamilton the Podcast. That's cheesy.
This has been a Graphomania production. To hear our other podcasts, head over to graphocast.com, GRAPHOCAST.com.